This is Reimagining Higher Education, your go-to podcast with remarkable education leaders sharing personal stories from their experience in and around the sector, including reflection and evidence for progress in the sector, with your host, Studiosity's founder and president of Friends of Libraries Australia, Jack Goodman. Welcome.
Well, my guest today is Martin Betts. He is the co-founder of HEDx and a former senior executive at many universities in Australia. I'd like to welcome you, Martin, to our podcast.
Very nice to be here, Jack, and lovely to see the roles reversed from when you joined me on the HEDx podcast a little while ago. Great to reciprocate. Thanks for having me.
It is good fun, and I think these conversations are not just enjoyable, but incredibly valuable for all of us to crystallize our thinking and sharpen our understanding and share ideas. So I'm very grateful as someone who has been in the sector and is now sort of working in it, around it, and for it, bringing your enormous years, decades of experience, something that I do not have, and the depth of understanding that you have of how universities work from the inside out. As you know, I really only understand them from the outside looking in. So hopefully we can have a discussion today. Let's talk a little bit about the half of the university mission that's really focused on the teaching and learning component. And the spark for this really was the release of the 2021 QUILT data that was published a little belatedly, I think in August or September. And I think as you know, and others do, that I'm particularly interested in from my vantage point, very much focused on the student experience and making sure that students are getting the kinds of teaching and learning experiences and outcomes that our universities want for them, and of course that our nation needs for them. So I wonder if you just had any sort of opening sort of reflections about how QUILT works and what it's used for, and sort of what your view of it is.
Sure, it is important data, and we were all anxiously and eagerly, some more eagerly than others, I guess, awaiting the 2021 data coming out so late as it did in 2022. I think it's come out later in the year than the year before, and the 2020 data was always going to be interesting for us at the first year of a pandemic. I dare say next year, when the 2022 data comes out, it will be another big reality check and milestone in the transitions that the sector's going through, that every university is going through, that its leaders and its students are going through. I mean, if I start with 2020 data before coming to what we learned in August and September this year, I mean, clearly there was a big shock in the big fall in the measures of satisfaction, engagement, and all the rest of it in 2020. We would have expected that. I mean, we did have wonderful responses by staff and by institutions and by leaders. I know they've been referred to as the heroes of the hour, and Jane Den Hollander, for me, famously called them the gold at the base of the pyramid at the time in making fantastic efforts to turn things around. And I think it's the case that some were better prepared than others. Individual academics were better prepared than others by what they'd done before. Individual universities were better prepared than others with where their commitments had been. But another for me notable reference to the 2020 experience and response was Sally Kift, who referred to a US study that had coined the term panic-gogy instead of pedagogy. You may be familiar with that one, Jack. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of response rather than measured reactions to, or maybe I should call them reactions rather than measured responses to the challenge at that time. So the 2021 data coming a year later, I think there's been lots of hope that the big falls in the primary QUILT measures would see recoveries, and there have been some partial recoveries, but they're not great. They're not substantial. It's relatively quiet. We hear a lot about good scores in our universities on rankings and measures of the like when we want to tell a story about them.
Yeah.
This is one that we haven't told so much, and I think we need to shine a light on a little bit more. And the 2021 data is a bit of an improvement on the big shock of 2020, but there's still a long way to go to get back to where we were, even assuming that where we were is where we should have been in the first place.
Yeah, I agree with you in terms of that analysis. I think 2020 was an understandable shock, and we all expected that. And your point about some universities being better prepared than others, as in having more of a digital presence running up to 2020. So they had tools in place that they could use, whereas some of the really more purely campus-focused institutions did have, subscriptions and technologies, but really didn't have an integrated approach to digital delivery that made it particularly easy. So they really did slap together solutions. And I think Jane Denhollander is exactly right. It was a heroic effort by teaching staff, but it was hardly ideal circumstances. It was sort of an Apollo 13 rescue mission. You don't really plan for it. But when you have no other choice, it's amazing how creative people can be. 2021, you're right. There's an incremental recovery in some of the scores, but you got to remember also that 2021 was probably a worse experience pandemic-wise in New South Wales than 2020 was. 2020 and 2021 were really terrible in Victoria. Those are the two biggest states, and so if you look at the data for the universities in New South Wales, I don't think students had a particularly enjoyable time with those lockdowns and the sort of pulsating nature of the ongoing pandemic and the impact that had on life. And there is this Wall Street expression. I'm kind of fond of these expressions. I think I quoted Warren Buffett last time, but there is this expression when usually it refers to a company's stock price, but when a stock has a collapse, and we sort of had a collapse of our data, our student experience data in 1 year, and then it comes back up. There's always that question that stock traders have: is this a genuine recovery, or is it what they call a dead cat bounce, as in a cat bouncing off of the pavement? I don't think this is a dead cat bounce, but I think it's wrong to interpret one year of data as a trend line also. So we really will have to see, and of course the upside of this data is that it's incredibly thorough. The downside is we only get it as a snapshot once a year. So it's really hard to know what's moving the data year on year as well.
Yeah, for sure. And look, that data is also showing, you've commented there on between 2020 and 2021, the differences of experiences more generally in the major states of Australia. I think we've also seen a light shone on how different universities, not only in terms of their individual preparedness for digital delivery, but the difference between big metropolitan universities in all of our states compared with smaller regional universities, and the difference between our longest established and highest ranked research universities.
Yeah.
And the promises that they have been making of expectations to students by virtue of those rankings.
Right.
I think a light's getting shone here for all of our universities that's playing out differently in metropolitans and the regionals and between genres, in the extent to which the student experience is meeting the expectation that we've built up in the past.
Yeah.
And that's actually creating quite different needs for reactions from all of our universities now in terms of how they're going to manage the extent of the bounce, the fall that they've had, right, and the bounce that they need to make from it, I think.
Right. Yeah, I think that is a really good point. I mean, one of the places that I can't quite draw my eyes away from when I look through the data is there's this component of it, which is the learner engagement data, which is really about student sense of belonging. It really is the at the core of how do students feel about their relationship with their institution. And it's based on about 5 questions that are largely around whether you've had any interactions with peers, either face-to-face on campus in your course or just at the university or online. And there are a few other questions around that. But those learner engagement numbers, just if you go all the way back to the beginning of Quilt, which is 2011, 2012, they really just hovered around the high 50s to low 60s, which meant that, 58 to 60% of students had a positive learner engagement score, but roughly 40% didn't. And then, of course, last year and the year before, those numbers dropped down into the mid 40s. Now they're still below 50%. So, technically more than half of students don't have a strong sense of belonging, at least as of 2021, in the university. And that, from my perspective, I look at that and I think, gee, that is really a concerning place for the sector to be, because it's 800,000 students that we're talking about. That's roughly half of the student cohort, and we really need them to feel like they are wanted and loved and supported. And clearly, right now, we've had this jolt to the system, but that's really impacted that. But even before the pandemic, it wasn't great. The numbers weren't what they probably should be, or what a best practice might look like.
Yeah, well, 2011 is an interesting point to go back to. I found myself having a conversation just recently talking about variety of some of the data in this area of learner engagement. I had a conversation with Australia's University Teacher of the Year in 2020, is a associate professor at UQ called Jack Wang, a biologist. I don't know if you've come across him, and he's made a lovely little video of looking back over the last 20 years rather than the last 10 years of Australian university teaching. And he calls these 7 phases that we've gone through, from when he first was a student himself, or coming out of being a student and joining as a postdoc UQ, the sort of chalk and talk period, as it was, that got quickly followed by the PowerPoint, or as it soon got called, the death by PowerPoint experience, the emergence of LMSs, the emergence of automatic lecture capture, and brought that all the way through the sort of COVID Zoom practices that we've had in the period that we're talking about, quilt data here, with a critical and a challenging conversation as part of his video about the extent to which students are engaged, to a point where he calls the current phase one of a no man's land. Really?
That's fascinating. And in what way is it a no man's land?
Well, he describes it as, indeed, David Kellerman, you may know.
Yeah, David, I remember him. Sure. Yeah, I think you interviewed him. Yeah,
I did. And he commented on Jack's video himself, and has commented recently on the phenomena that we're describing as learning taking place in absentia. I mean, we've got this, for me, ironic set of pictures going on of, there's a lot in the sector that wish we were engaging students in vibrant campuses, like the image that we have of what universities should be. And we've had the last couple of weeks in the semesters that have started this year of celebrating that they're back. It's back to making great use of our real estate, our learning assets, and our programs as they were. We'd all wish that it was like that. Gets contrasted at the end of the semester with these, I'm sure you've seen them, lecturers taking pictures of empty lecture theatres.
Yeah.
A staff member in the front talking to a camera in a room that might have 1 or 2 students in it at best.
Right.
And the learning taking place in absentia. And that's what Jack's referring to, the no man's land. And I found the study, I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's a journal study coming out of UCLA from earlier this year.
Yeah, tell us about it.
Yeah, so a group of academics there who've observed that in their understanding from surveying students, 85% of their students are watching lectures in absentia, but they're speeding them up. Maybe that's not a surprise to anybody. And so they conducted some research studies of groups of UCLA students. They experimented with testing the comprehension of classroom delivery if people watched their lectures or classes at normal speed, at 1.5 times speed, and at twice speed.
Yep.
And found insignificant differences in student comprehension. Now, these are students that aren't engaging. These aren't learners engaging with academics. They're watching content.
Yep.
And I've quizzed my own son about this. My son's a graduate of a GO8 university for a couple of years ago. He tells me that he's researched it and found that 1.6 times normal speed is the optimum for him.
Right.
The voice doesn't quite get so high pitched that it's annoying, but you can still get through. He talked about, SWAT vac just became the time when you could knock out 9 lectures one after the other at 1.5 or 1.6 normal speeds.
Yep.
And free yourself up from the need to attend regularly and get engaged with learning at times that universities were making it available to you. Now, if 85% of UCLA students are doing that, I dare say many Australian students are doing that.
Oh yeah, there's going to be negligible difference to hear.
For sure. And if that's how you're, as a student, choosing to engage with the learning that's being offered to you by a university, the opportunity, it surprises me that if that's the case, we have as many as 50% or close to 50% feeling that they are engaged, because it's the no man's land that Jack's referring to is the need for us to find different ways, using technology, using new pedagogy, of making provision and engaging learners in environments where the empty lecture theatre and recorded lectures and watched back synchronously or asynchronously is poorly equipped for what students are choosing to do.
Yeah. I'll make a comment and then I'm going to ask you a question, Martin. You've been in the sector for decades, your entire career. Most of my professional career has been in education technology, and certainly the last 20 years in Australia, working in and around higher education. I had this conversation with a dean of science at a university in Sydney at least a dozen years ago. And it was let's say 2011, I think so, 11 years ago. It was just around the time that we were starting to see the idea of the MOOC come along, or early professors publishing their own lectures. And there was a few outliers. These were people who were really into technology. And there were some quite famous professors putting up really impressive content. And I just recall one being an introductory physics course being taught by a very experienced and incredibly entertaining professor from MIT, who just took his lectures and published them online. And this university in Sydney, this dean had said, we're noticing that we have almost no attendance after week 1 or week 2 of our lectures in this first year physics class in our engineering school. And I said, well, do you have any idea why that is? He said, well, I didn't. So I went and started asking the students who were on campus, what are you doing instead? What have you found? Or are you just, what's wrong with our lectures? And they said, oh, look, professor, we're watching this guy from MIT. And he said, oh, I went and looked it up and I watched the lectures and I said, they're terrific. They're way better than what we do. And I said, well, what does that make you think? And he said, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what we should do about that. We'll sort of sit on that. And so that was 11 years ago. I would just posit that this has been going on for a long time. It's not just the pandemic that brought this out. YouTube's had a feature of speeding up audio. Podcasts are doing it all the time. And if you listen to a lot of content, you can, depending on how it's delivered, you can accelerate it and you can increase your comprehension or certainly reduce the amount of time it takes to absorb information. It doesn't always work. If content is really complex, deep, you might have to pause, reflect, rewind, but they're probably doing all that as well. It also depends on whether they're multitasking, in which case I think speeding anything up is ridiculous, and probably even just watching at normal speed is ridiculous. But my question for you would be, so that's just to say, I think this has been happening for many, many years. This isn't new, but what I'm wondering is some of this or a lot of this about us coming to a point in time where we, because of the nature of technology, because of where we are in the world and where students are and wanting to be, that we really need to start rethinking and investing much more heavily in how we reimagine the teaching and learning experience. And that's just part of the sort of a systemic, maybe underinvestment or overweighting of the research mission and an underweighting of the teaching and learning side of the university mission.
I'm absolutely sure you're right about that. I mean, that very interesting, your anecdote about 12 years ago. I mean, I can support the view that you're promoting there. I can remember I've been about 20 years working in Australian universities, same sort of period of time as you. And I can recall 15, 12 years ago, can't remember exactly which, starting to see data coming through of where the students at the university I worked at the time, once we worked out they weren't in lectures, we tried to work out where they were. Mm-hmm. We quite often found that they were on campus, but outside the lecture theatre, watching it as a live lecture and talking with their fellow classmates about it, or multitasking, eating and doing other things. So I think we have had, it's not quilt data, but we've had access to information and data about this phenomena going on for a long time. I mean, I'm absolutely sure that we do need to invest more in the teaching and learning agenda, and I think a tipping point will come quite soon when that becomes urgent for us. Because you talking about YouTube lectures and brilliant lectures from MIT, I'm reading a really interesting book at the moment by somebody called Paul LeBlanc, the president of Southern New Hampshire University. I haven't got all the way through it yet, but his book Students First so far has exposed to me two dominant thoughts that he has. One that, because I don't think it's all about the level of investment. I also think it's about a change in attitude and philosophy.
I agree.
We probably need both. And his first point about the inappropriateness of the current philosophy is the concept of time, that we measure everything in a university education about something that's got to happen over 3 years.
Yep.
It's got to happen over 3 or 4 years. It's got to happen over 6 or 8 semesters. It's got to be 4 courses, units, programs, whichever you call them in your university per semester. They do need about 3 hours a week of study. Yep. Isn't it a coincidence that everything gets measured in 3 hours a week, 4 of them a semester times 6 or 8 for over 3 or 4 years? So it's of course ludicrous. It's a convenience for the provider rather than a need of the learner. Mm-hmm. People see through that quickly, and he goes on in this book to talk about the problem with the model being not only is it based upon time, but it fails to be based upon what someone has learned through that process in terms of competency. Rather, all that they've done is showed that they've been exposed for a period of time, and they can be assessed on what they have experienced during that time, not what they can do with that experience in what their qualifications leading to. So I'm quite taken with some of the ideas in that book and the debate and leading practices from around the world. And of course, the thing that connects with your ideas about MIT and YouTube is that the competency is measured. If we went to a competency model rather than a time model, we wouldn't just measure whether someone has done their time at the University of wherever in Australia. We would measure competency by whether they've acquired it from YouTube learning resources, from a lecture from MIT or Southern New Hampshire or Oxford, rather than just have they gained it from us. So I think a change in attitude about the inflexible way that we're providing learning programs and measuring competency with extra investment would actually increase learner engagement and lead to a better model.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And just for listeners' benefit, Paul LeBlanc is quite a well-known figure in North America. He's been leading University of Southern New Hampshire, I think, for a couple of decades at least, and he's really transformed it. It's an largely online university, and it's grown enormously. I think it's got something like 170,000 students now. So he's a real pioneer in this space, kind of like Michael Crow at Arizona State. And that whole idea that, the whole idea of the semester model of teaching and learning, and the semester model of decision-making is something that he's been very keen to sort of demonstrate that you can blow it up. But I don't think I think Southern New Hampshire is in a little bit of a different situation from our universities here, Martin, in the sense that I don't know that it's got much of a research agenda. You can call a university in America without having all of the requirements for excellence in research like we have here, I believe. But it's very much of a, his book is Students First, and everything is about trying to provide economic mobility for people who otherwise might not have had a chance to go to university. So it's a lot of non-traditional students too. But more power to them. I mean, it's a remarkable story, and I will like to read that book as well. So pass it along when you're done.
Will do.
But yeah, I was going to just come back to the lecture thing. Something Merlin Crossley wrote the other day in online in one of his columns. He's the DVC over at UNSW, and he talked a lot about just the value of the lecture and how important that is, and saying it's we should have a smorgasbord of lots of different options, and the lecture should be one of them, maybe not the only thing, but let's not throw it out because it serves a great purpose. And when I interviewed him, he talked a lot about his enthusiasm for the lecture and what he had seen, experienced as a student, and what he tries to do when he gives a lecture. And I think the word that we just need to associate with lecture is where the lecture takes place. It takes place in a lecture theater. Uh-huh. And a lecture theater is meant to be a place where a performance occurs, right? And we've all been to lectures that have been theatrical, where the person up on the stage has put on a show. And when that person puts on a show, well, you really want to be there. It's a live show. If you've ever been to live theater, it's a high wire act. It doesn't always go according to plan, but it's memorable and it can be spectacular. And it's certainly always impressive to watch someone try to pull it off, even if they don't quite pull it off. But if someone comes into a lecture theater and reads a sheaf of paper and some notes and scribbles something on the board and never looks up and makes no eye contact, or otherwise is just there is no real engagement with the audience, well, that's not really theater at all. And so I think we really do need to distinguish between these things. And if we are going to have lectures, they need a theatrical component, or you aren't going to have students attend. And they're going to just sit at home and they're going to play them at 1.6 times speed. I don't know. Do you agree with that?
Well, I mean, I do agree with that. And I'm actually triggered by your emphasis of the word theatre to look to the parallels with what we're talking about with other forms of other areas of the economy, because I think we are on the verge of major systemic change. And I think we have much that we can learn from other areas of systemic change. So I won't go to theatrical performance, but if we were to talk about television or music or film,
other intellectual endeavors,
we have seen other areas in which content is made available to consumers, if I can use that language, where there's been quite a transformation in models of delivery, organizations delivering it, and how it can be experienced by customers or by learners. So the idea that we would watch a television program at a set time on a free-to-air seems such a historic concept now. And the idea that we would buy music by going, and I can still remember what an LP is, or an album.
Tell me about it. I've still got them.
Yeah, no, I've got them. I love them. They scratch in all the great old places. But I hardly ever can be bothered to get up and put it on and listen to the other 3 tracks that go with the one that I really want to get to.
Exactly.
Rather than just flick through my Spotify platform and be offered things that I haven't heard before that are of the genre that are things that I like.
Yeah.
Now, I've got a new book coming out with Michael Roseman of QUT called The New Learning Economy. Yeah. Where we've really tried to pick some examples of out-of-sector new business models driven by technology, like Spotify in a personalization sense, like Netflix with its generation of scale, like YouTube, like Amazon, like Google and others, and think, can't some of those models and some of those principles apply to how we will see learning in the future? So, look, yes, like you and like Merlin, I can see great value in fantastic lecturers, and I can remember presentations live on a stage that have inspired me and really grabbed me. But I go and see those sorts of things very occasionally.
That's not that often, right?
I spend a lot of time listening to Spotify, watching Netflix, and choosing to listen to a podcast like yours when it suits me at my time in the car when I'm driving.
So I agree. And I think that's a really interesting point. I would just like to, again, remind our listeners and all of us to think about this, that this is not a new phenomenon. The original time shifting capability with television occurred in 1979 when the Betamax was released. People have been time shifting television since the mid 1980s when the VCR became commonplace. We time shifted. It was a bit of a nuisance. You had to set up the machine to record. It was clunky. It wasn't digital. It had an analog or a little digital clock, and usually the parents couldn't figure it out, so the teenagers had to do it for them. But we've been time shifting for better part of 40 years at least. When DVDs came along, it was easier, and streaming services, obviously, that just literally exploded the advertising model of broadcast and free-to-air TV, right? So for us to be surprised that students want to time shift lectures is kind of a bit rich, given that we have time shifted, all of us, our lives for the last 40 years. I mean, I remember, we all remember watching, renting movies and watching it when you wanted to. That was, and the movie industry was, apoplectic about this, destroying people's willingness to go to the theater. What it did was it made them rethink why we need to deliver stuff that people want to see in a theatrical way. That was easier done when people still had crummy little cathode ray tube televisions. Now we all have these beautiful big screens at home. So the movie theaters have to keep upping their game. But I think universities have been quite protected in many ways through all of this. And now there's a little bit of a pent up kind of situation, and the pandemic really exacerbated, and I think really shone a very bright light on the sort of sector's sort of reluctance to embrace some of these things. One thing I was just going to thought I might draw our attention to, move along a little bit here, Martin, is some of the difference between how our public and private providers, public universities and private institutions have performed in terms of their student experience. It's really quite remarkable, isn't it? Where you sort of see, when you look at them spread across the sort of gradations of the overall student experience, within the public sector, it seems like those really big research intensive universities may be overrepresented at one side, and some of the smaller private universities at the other. And then when you look at the public versus private, a similar discrepancy. What do you make of that?
Yeah, no, it's there's given how much our different providers of higher education, certainly in Australia, have so many similarities, and the culture of the sector and the regulation of the sector has a lot to do with that. It's also intriguing for me, and I think for many, to see how different that their approaches have been with trying to innovate in this sort of space, and the successes that they've had or otherwise. And I think that gets amplified if you look, as we have in this conversation, beyond the shores of Australia, at innovators in Europe, Asia, and North America in particular. I mean, I referred to one book that I've just got coming out with Michael Roseman on the new learning economy. I've got another book on the new leadership agenda, which comes from 50 conversations I've had with leaders of our universities across Australia and around the world in the last couple of years. One of them was you, Jack, and you're
yeah, I remember it well.
I do too. And I also remember being really struck by how the difference between edtech companies like your own and the other people from the edtech sector, and some universities who'd really embraced partnership with the edtech sector in a much more strategic way. I mean, I think the edtech sector is being used in lots of ways to outsource to better providers the challenge of student engagement and learner engagement, and there's lots of evidence of success for institutions and their learners in doing that. But I think the big difference is in how some of them have been much more strategic, the long-term view about how to do that, and how engaged they've been and focused on the student process. I mean, you mentioned Michael Crow and Arizona State University there a little bit earlier when we were talking about Paul LeBlanc. I think the way that ASU, through its alliance with GSV, the Global Silicon Valley Group, has built an edtech system over a sustained period of 13 years to build extraordinary learning platforms, we don't have, I think, any Australian universities that have taken that same strategic approach. And
Yeah,
one of my most recent conversations coming into that series was with Ian Dunn, the provost of Coventry University.
Sure.
Across them, the way that they're taking a mature view of CRM technology and an ecosystem of edtech to connect with that. So public-private, I think private companies that have embraced technology and focused on learning experience are quite broadly achieving much better results. I think public universities have the scope and the possibility to connect with that, and some of them are doing it really well, and some of them are really not making it a priority. And there's an opportunity for many more to do this better, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think one of the things Michael Crow has acknowledged there is this idea of comparative advantage. And sort of, you learned it in macroeconomics 101, but that even if an organization, and the universities can be a very large organization like they are here, can potentially do everything itself or do everything better than some other organization, it should still focus on the things it does best, and it should probably trade or partner to do things that it isn't going to do best. And in the case of these sort of digital initiatives, solving problems that aren't intrinsic to the traditional analog model of the university and just are going to be complicated and expensive to build and maintain from a technological perspective, it makes so much sense to partner and to use those technologists that are focused fully on solving a component of this digital problem that is only getting more complex. I was going to ask, though, one thing we haven't talked too much about, but is clearly something universities love to talk about is not so much the Quilt rankings or data, but the many other myriad university rankings, which tend to shine a very, very positive, glowing spotlight on our sector. And they tend to, I think we probably agree, tend to focus more on the research side and the reputational side of the sector. And I'm just wondering if you maybe reflect on that a little bit, but also comment on where incentives and behaviors might be reflected in these rankings and in universities' priorities in trying to optimize their outcomes in these rankings.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point, Jack. And there is a proliferation of rankings now, aren't there? We've just seen our second sustainability ranking emerge from the rankings industry that seems to be chugging along at great speed and at fast rates of growth globally. They of course thrive on the ability to make evidence-based assessments across international boundaries, and I think that the advantage for research is that is more internationally comparable in terms of some of the metrics of inputs and outputs. Teaching and learning, I think we should recognize, we've talked about Quilt data and moved on from it, but the initiative in establishing an independent database of Quilt data that objectively has measured and compared and published data on the student experience and learner engagement across the whole nation is fantastic. It's great that it exists. There are similar things in the UK and the US and other countries around the world, but you can't compare between them because of the systems for learning and teaching are too different.
That is true that you can't quite compare, but I would just say specifically at the UK, I think the Office for Students is who runs the equivalent study, the student National Student Survey, I think it's called, in the UK. And I do think there is a little bit of a difference between how that is conducted and how this one is managed, because this one is, funded by the government just like theirs is, but rather than there being a sort of autonomous government office that's clearly specifically in support of students, this is run through a group that's sort of at ANU. And when you do look at it, when you actually read the text and look at how the data is presented, it's certainly, there's a little bit of a lens that's been put on it. I would suggest that is not quite the students first lens that I think the Office for Students puts on their data.
Well, I bow to your better understanding of the details and what's under the hood on these things. I think coming back to your earlier question, are the incentives and behaviours and the priorities of universities focused on this? I'd have to say I don't think enough. I think they've become so focused on research prowess because of its ability to raise their position in the rankings, and I think we're approaching a point where that has to change. If as you say, the quilt data is showing us that less than 50% of our students are feeling engaged with their learning, that's a situation ripe for alternative provision, whether it's global competitors, private providers, and edtech companies. And I think there's enough evidence that I'm seeing of what the data looks like for demand for teaching and learning in degrees in universities around the globe and close to home that people need to it needs to become people's priority. Yeah. I mean, some of the data out of the US, I'm sure you've got your eye on it, on student numbers reducing and moving more to online providers. I think a lot of the talk in Australia at the moment is of a softening of domestic demand.
Yes.
And I'm sure most of us would like to think and believe this is a cyclical variation tied to high employment rates.
Temporary, right.
I hope enough of it is down to that phenomenon that we'll all come back. Who knows whether we aren't seeing the same sort of thing that's happening in the US of a questioning of the value of this big block of time of 3 or 4 years of study and
is it worth it?
Delivery that isn't engaging us.
Well, we make it relatively affordable for domestic students in Australia. The US makes it almost prohibitively expensive, and so there's a much sharper reason for people to really question that in the US. We have 3-year degrees, and we really do have a pretty good loan scheme with the HEDx help debt.
Yeah, but, well, let's hope that might soften the blow.
Yeah. But one of the places where I think universities are being a little bit surprised is that all those international students who really underpin the economics of our biggest universities, a lot of them, who ended up, I think we were initially surprised that they stayed enrolled and studied online, but now we're wondering, are they going to come back? And many of them are saying we want to just finish our degree online. And if that's the case, where does that leave the international student market after the pandemic?
Yeah, I think what you're putting shining a light on there is that the questions of whether the size of the market will change is one thing, but the question of whether the nature of the market and the demand for learning has also, or instead is changing even greater, is one that I think needs a lot of focus and means that our responses to rebuilding learner engagement will need to reflect whatever changes in the size and the nature of the market. And I'm sure technology, I'm sure the sort of things that entertainment and music and film have been through more than 20 years ago are some of the phenomena that we must learn from, and we have the opportunity to learn from in reimagining higher education in Australia and being a really strong competitive provider and doing the right things for students who we put first.
I've got one last question for you, Martin. We've been through this traumatic global event. It's definitely shown a light on all these areas that the sector is, where it's doing okay, but clearly where it can do better as well. What's your take on universities as a sector in Australia and their capability to make decisions rapidly enough to respond to these circumstances?
Yeah, well, again, one of the triumphs of 2020 and through 2021-22, I think Jane Denholder is right. It's the staff that were the heroes of the hour, and our students and all that they've been through. And there really is gold at the base of the pyramid, as she says. I think we also have to pay tribute to how institutions and their leadership did keep business continuity with quick decisions at the time, and for goodness sake, repeated change decisions. So look, on all of those counts, I think we've shown that we have the capability to change and to evolve and to take bold decisions. But we're not in those times now. We're coming through the other side of that. We're in catch-up mode. We're now looking at what the models might be for the future. And that same capacity to be visionary and to be clear in decision-making and to do it in partnership with other people, I think is the priority right now for all of our institutions moving forward. There was a lovely OECD report. Sorry, it's not an OECD report. It's a UNESCO report on higher education that came out earlier this year. And it talked about one of the biggest risks for universities globally is their inability to take risks.
Yeah, interesting.
And I think that's really the time that we've got to now, that one of the biggest challenges for universities right now, if they're really going to recognize that learner engagement and student experience is of primary concern, is the decisions that they're going to put in place and the partnerships they're going to build and the actions that they're going to promote to really be in a good position for the medium term and the innovation that's in front of us. And the university that masters that through a new strategy in partnership with other organizations, including edtech providers, will I think have a great opportunity to really crack this and be in a significant position of advantage in the future.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I just really, really hope that as we do come out of the pandemic, that the way that the pandemic forced the sector to move quickly and to think on its feet, that it doesn't lose that and think that those skills aren't needed now that we're no longer in this sort of crisis moment. Because I do think that actually the pandemic has shifted student expectations, and we're seeing it in the data. And there's a long game to be played here, which is that we need to see our institutions continue to keep their foot on the accelerator of embracing change and trying to solve these problems in new ways, because that's what the times demand. And there's no going back to 2019. At least that's my view.
Certainly mine too, Jack. And look, it's great to have a podcast like yours and the things that we've been trying to do with help from people like you in HEDx over the last 2 or 3 years to try and facilitate the conversation that can allow people to be on that journey. I think we need to have more conversations like this and more actions that they generate about taking risks and pursuing innovation to do what would really put our students first and to safeguard the future of our universities and the health of the sector.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Martin. It has been such a pleasure.
Great to be with you, Jack. Thanks for having me on.
Visit studiosity.com/studentsfirst for the next Students First Symposium, an open forum for faculty, staff, and academics to candidly discuss and progress the issues that matter most in higher education. Visit studiosity.com/studentsfirst